We're back after a break. Mr. Rose, I see you on screen.
Yeah, two things. One, and I think I alluded to this earlier. If you were looking to limit the chat function to talk to you, it doesn't. Right now, it's for everybody. And I think in the past, it's been just to communicate with you. So if you wanted to do that, you're going to have to make some changes. And then secondly, I didn't know if this was the proper time to talk about the discussion that you had this morning on my objections to admissibility of certain evidence. I think just to be clear, our position is to allow, basically, you can admit the evidence subject to objection, and we'll raise it probably with the board in the same manner that the board's counsel talked about the NMOGA exclusions. But rather than tying it up and arguing a motion, we thought rather just admit it subject to objection, and then we'll raise it in our post-hearing submittals with the board.
Okay, thank you for that, Mr. Rose. I am happy to proceed as you suggested, and was reminded of the agreement amongst the parties about that objection. And what I was just trying to do this morning was wrap up something I thought was a loose end and be transparent about my intentions. I see Ms. Fox.
Thank you, Madam Hearing Officer. I think Mr. Rose and I are crossing wires because I thought that what we had more recently agreed to was that we would argue the objections and get that over with at this time so that our evidence, if you overrule the objection, would come in not subject to the objection, and so that we would not have to brief the issue post-hearing. Our resources are limited, and since, Madam Hearing Officer, you've already indicated your feelings, your thinking on the objections, we would like to go forward with argument on that and get it out of the way. One less thing for us to have to deal with.
And Madam Hearing Officer, I think we avoided the argument. We intend to raise it in our closing argument anyway. So the issue will be, as I think, because it goes to the admissibility and the board's consideration of the evidence, we'll be arguing whether the evidence is relevant in our post-hearing submittals in any event. And so I thought the discussion was, and you're right, I think Ms. Fox is right, we seem to have talked past each other on this, but what we were trying to do is avoid the argument here. And then, because we're going to have it again regardless, if the hearing officers rather just take the evidence, make sure we don't get wound up in, and it'll be a continuing objection even if it's overruled. And so thought it might be more appropriate to take the evidence and then allow us to argue and close in our closing argument whether or not the board should consider it. Mainly because we intend to make that argument to the board in any event. So I don't think we save anything by arguing it now. And in fact, I think we'll end up sort of lengthening the process, not necessarily preserving limited resources here. So that was my intent, was to avoid the argument on admissibility here and just do it with counsel later in the closing argument.
All right, Ms. Fox, anything further?
I'm sorry, pardon me?
I'm sorry, anything further?
No, Madam Hearing Officer, at this point, we would just like the objection dealt with as any other objection is to the admissibility introduction of evidence and argue it. And we'd like to see all the evidence admitted.
Right.
So
okay.
we would like to argue it. Although I don't know if, given what you said this morning, I'm not sure you need to entertain much argument, but we would like our evidence admitted.
All right, Ms. Katz, any thoughts?
I just would like to register that anything that would make things move more quickly, I think would be better. So I would be in favor of briefing that issue and admitting the evidence subject to the briefing.
Okay. Um, so, um, Mr. Rose, what if we were to set aside some time so that I could develop um, the recommendation to the board? I understand you're going to brief it regardless. Um, and yet, what I have is my understanding of the record, my understanding of the testimony we've already had, my impression that the board will not be confused by the references to methane, but at least hearing whatever you'd like to develop on the way to the close of the hearing, I could address that in my recommendation to the board. I'm happy to find a time other than, again, when we have this prize board time, um, to put that on the record. We could do it at the end of the day, um, on a lunch break. Let's think about a good time to do that.
Madam Hearing Officer, that's fine. I was trying to avoid going through that exercise and making sure that, the board had the evidence and then we could decide, we could argue to them. And I think they're capable of deciding whether to consider it or not consider it. I don't think it's going to taint the board's deliberation. So that was my thought, was to avoid an argument here in order to expedite the process, but I'm open to either way.
All right, let's just think about a good time to do it so we're not using premium um, uh, board time. Do I understand we're going from here to the department's LDAR presentation?
Yes, thank you, Madam Hearing Officer. Good morning, Madam Chair and members of the board. The department calls Liz Bisbee Keene and Brian Palmer. For the board, this testimony pertains to section 20.2.50.116, equipment leaks and fugitive emissions. The testimony appears in NMUD Exhibit 32 beginning at page 79, and NMED Rebuttal Exhibit 1 beginning at page 56. Ms. Keene and Mr. Palmer have adopted their testimony, and there's no corrections to this section. So I'll have Ms. Keene begin with an overview of what this section of the rule regulates.
Good morning, everyone. As indicated, this is section 116, equipment leak and fugitive emissions. And I'll provide an overview of what exactly fugitive emissions are for you. So there's a large number of equipment, including valves, pumps, and other equipment associated with natural gas production and processing that can be a significant source of VOC emissions. And equipment leaks occur from pumps, pressure relief devices, valves, flanges, and connectors, and seals. And sources of leaks also include open-ended lines and valves, as well as corrosion of connections, valves, and flanges. The leaks are typically caused by poorly fitted connection points and deterioration of seals and gaskets, and can also occur in changes in pressure, temperature, and mechanical stresses. Components that emit fugitive emissions include valves, connectors, pressure relief devices, open-ended lines, access doors, flanges, closement systems, seals, pumps, vents, and all the other equipment listed out here before you.
And Ms. Keen, can you discuss how fugitive emissions can be addressed?
Yeah, the control options for fugitive emissions include the implementation of an emission leak detection and repair program, otherwise referred to as an LDAR program. These types of programs reduce fugitive emissions by requiring owners and operators to inspect their facilities and equipment to find and repair leaking components and equipment. And the leak detection methods include audio, visual, and olfactory inspections, or EVO inspections, that we've seen in other parts of the rule. Also, an instrument monitoring in accordance with an EPA Federal Reference Method 21, or alternatively, the use of monitoring using optical gas imaging, OGI, which we have also seen in other sections of the rule. And this is typically done using a FLIR camera, a forward-looking infrared camera that can detect hydrocarbons. AVO inspections rely on the sight, sound, and smell to identify leaking components. The EPA reference method 21 identifies leaks using a portable instrument that detects the presence of certain organic gases and is able to measure the actual volumetric concentration of emissions. And optical gas imaging is a newer method for leak detection and repair that uses, as I indicated, forward-looking infrared cameras to inspect equipment components to identify those leaking equipment. Optical gas imaging can be used to survey large numbers of components in a shorter period of time, or in a short amount of time. And while EPA reference method 21 requires an instrument probe and requires components to be evaluated on an individual basis. OGI can also be used in aerial surveys, and so you can identify much more, many more types of emissions from many more numbers of facilities using that type of technology as well. The overall effectiveness of an LDAR program to control fugitive emissions is based on the frequency of the monitoring and the leak definition. And it follows that more frequent monitoring means leaks are discovered more quickly and repaired sooner, resulting in less harmful air pollution.
And Ms. Keen, can you summarize the requirements of the rule for address fugitive emissions?
Yes, there are two concepts in this rule that are important. There's one set of requirements that are a default monitoring requirements that prescribe certain frequencies of monitoring, and that is what you see before you. The default monitoring requirements apply to the inspections of equipment and leaking components in facilities with a production or throughput greater than 10 barrels per day or 60,000 standard cubic feet per day of gas, require weekly AVO inspections, while facilities with production or throughput less than 10 barrels of oil per day or production less than 60,000 standard cubic feet per day require a monthly AVO inspection. In addition, there are prescribed LDAR frequencies for facilities using either EPA methods or OGI, according to the following schedules. Well sites and tank batteries are required to be surveyed annually at facilities with a PTE less than 2 tons per year, semi-annually at facilities with a PTE between 2 and 5 tons per year, and quarterly at facilities with a PTE greater than 5 tons per year. For gathering and boosting stations, gas processing plants, and transmission compressor stations, the requirement is to conduct a quarterly LDAR survey at facilities with a PTE less than 25 tons per year, and monthly at facilities with a PTE equal to or greater than 25 tons per year. There's also an alternative monitoring component that I'll speak to in more detail when we go through the actual requirements in the proposed rule.
And can you summarize for the board the department's position now based on the testimony that was provided by the other parties in their direct and rebuttal filings?
Yes, so both industry and the environmental NGO parties submitted extensive testimony related to LDAR inspection frequencies. Both stakeholder groups cited studies related to LDAR with very competing data sets that are provide kind of opposing sets of data on LDAR effectiveness, the emission factors, leakage rates, component counts, fugitive emissions, costs, and representativeness of the EPA's data in New Mexico. The department was unable to conduct a meta-analysis of those competing studies and provided in the competing technical testimony and associated exhibits provided by the parties. The department attempted to provide a middle ground for the board's consideration between these competing data sets. That frequency schedule was more closely aligned with Colorado's LDAR program. And the department was unable to negotiate a middle ground between these two competing data sets. And further, the department was unable to sufficiently demonstrate the basis for that revision and has since reverted back to the original proposal that was filed in May. The parties' subject matter experts need to provide testimony regarding their cited peer-reviewed studies, the cost estimates, leakage rates, LDAR effectiveness, etc., directly to the board for the board's consideration.
Thank you, Ms. Keene. Can you please walk through the provisions of Section 2016 as they stand today?
Yes, so similar to the other sections that we've looked at previously, the applicability section discusses the sources that are subject to this section. We've added a clarifying clause that components in water or air service are not subject to the requirements of this part or this section, and that makes sense. If they're in water or air service, they are not sources of fugitive VOC emissions, and so it's not appropriate to include those components within the scope of this section. In addition, we added a clause that clearly states that the requirements of this part may be considered in the facility-wide PTE and in determining the monitoring frequency requirements in this section. So other sections' control requirements may be taken into consideration in a facility-wide PTE calculation in order to determine what frequency you're subject to. That's an important requirement that we clarified. The emission standards identify, again, the equipment that's subject to this part. I won't read that for you all. I think that's fairly self-explanatory. The default monitoring requirements begin in paragraph C. We've struck the requirement to monitor in accordance with section 112. There are no specific monitoring requirements applicable to this section there. Paragraph C1, as I spoke to on a previous slide, requires the AVO inspection for facilities that have that production or throughput less than those capacity rates identified on a weekly basis. And subparagraphs 1A through D require specify the type of inspection that has to be conducted and what an owner operator has to look for when they're conducting that AVO inspection. In paragraph 2, as I indicated on the previous slide, also is the equivalent inspection, AVO inspection requirement for facilities that have a daily production or throughput rate less than those capacity throughputs, and those are required on a monthly basis. And this section also references back to those subparagraphs A through D that I just went through, and that specifies what the owner operator must look at when they're conducting the AVO inspection. Paragraph 3 outlines the OGI, the optical gas imaging, or the EPA reference method, LDAR surveys that are required for all types of facilities that are subject to this rule. In addition, we added a requirement that the department may request an owner operator to conduct a survey at any time for good cause shown. In addition, we added a timeline for existing facilities to come into compliance within 2 years of the effective date of this part. And given the volume of facilities that will be covered under this rule, we think that's an appropriate compliance timeline. So the LDAR frequencies before you have been presented to you on a previous slide. So I won't go through those again here. They're exactly as they were discussed prior. Paragraph 4 requires calibration, or specifies how the unit must be calibrated prior to using a reference method 21 survey. And paragraph 4B identifies the leak detection rate that is considered, that would be considered a leak under this part. Inspection 5 outlines the requirements for inspections using an OGI. And we're pointing to a federal rule that requires specifications and daily instrument checks and other additional requirements that are set forth in those subparagraphs of paragraph I of that federal rule. And 5B clarifies that a leak detected associated with normal operation, such as one that occurs during pneumatic device actuation, is not considered a leak. That's an important point to make. Components, paragraph 6 identifies how owners and operators handle inspections of components that are difficult or unsafe or inaccessible to monitor. It provides for specific circumstances for how owners and operators handle that type of situation and how they're required to monitor those at the next process shutdown. Paragraph 7 requires that prior to any monitoring event, the owner or operator shall date and timestamp the monitoring event. Paragraph D outlines the alternative equipment leak monitoring plan. So paragraph C went through the default equipment leak monitoring plan. This is an alternative set of equipment leak monitoring plans. And the first option is for an individual alternative monitoring plan to be utilized. This is an alternative plan that would be proposed by a third party and reviewed in advance by the department to ensure it's an enforceable, equivalent, and appropriate monitoring strategy. And those would need to be approved by the department before an owner operator could comply with this section by complying with that type of individual alternative monitoring plan. There's also requirements for if violations are discovered, there's requirements for them to notify the department of the violation, and there's a process by which the department can terminate the use of that alternative monitoring plan. And the purpose of the alternative equipment leak monitoring plan is to provide an on-ramp into this section for the use of new technologies that are more effective at and more efficient at discovering leaks. So that, and those can take many forms. They can take the form of an aerial survey, satellite data, fence line monitoring, and other types of technology. So
Ms. Keen,
yeah,
sorry, I just wanted to clarify something, because you had said these would be provided by a third party, and I believe you meant that these would be proposed by an owner operator as an alternative to the default monitoring plan.
that's correct. And sorry if I was unclear about that. So the first type of alternative equipment like monitoring plan are covered in D1. And then the second type of alternative equipment leak monitoring plans are outlined in paragraph 2. Those are pre-approved plans, which still must go through an evaluation and review process by the department before they approve those monitoring plans. And the idea here is that the department will provide those pre-approved alternative monitoring plans on its website so that the public and the owners and operators know what the department has considered an equally effective and enforceable and equivalent monitoring strategy. And the process is the same. They must seek approval from the department. The department maintains the authority to terminate that approval in certain circumstances. Paragraph E outlines the repair requirements for these for leaks that are detected. And paragraph E1 requires owners and operators to place a visible tag on the leaking component, and unless it was repaired at the time of discovery. E2 identifies the repair timeline for leaks discovered in this section. Paragraph 3 requires those leaks to be remonitored no later than 15 days after the leak was repaired to demonstrate that it was repaired. And then E4 requires that leaks that need to be delayed because they can't be effectively controlled at that time within that timeline must be repaired at the next process unit shutdown, which is equivalent to other federal requirements that allow that type of leak repair extension. And paragraph 5 authorizes that leaks that can't be repaired due to a discovery of that can't be repaired due to a shortage of parts may be also repair delayed, provided that they document the basis for the extension, the necessary extension due to the delay of the shortage of parts. Paragraph 4 goes through all of the record keeping requirements to demonstrate compliance with this section. I won't go through this entire list here, but they're required, owners and operators have to record facility, location, the monitoring method, date and time of the inspection, the leaks that were identified, and the description of the leak needing repair, and then additional information on the type of leak and when the leak was repaired.
And I'll just clarify for the record that the record keeping requirements are paragraph F. I believe Ms. Keen misstated it as paragraph 4.
Yeah, been a long week. So again, these are additional record keeping requirements before you, and the reporting requirements are in paragraph G. We didn't receive any comments on those paragraphs. That concludes this presentation.
And that is the department's summary of the rule provisions at section 116.
All right, thank you very much, Ms. Katz and Ms. Keen. parties, if you have questions of Ms. Keene based on this testimony, please turn on your cameras. I see Ms. Gutierrez.
Thank you, Madam Hearing Officer. And Ms. Keene, thank you very much for your presentation and walkthrough of leak detection. I just have a few questions for you. Does the department recognize and agree that the VOC content of natural gas transported by a transmission compressor station is lower, much lower than the VOC content of gas moved in gathering and boosting and at gas plants?
Yes,
Do you agree then that it would be reasonable to treat transmission compressor stations differently than with respect to inspection frequency under this rule program?
yes,
Were you able to review the joint revised proposed language proposed by Kinder Morgan and EDF and circulated to the parties on Friday, September 24th?
yes.
And I'm happy to share my screen if that would be helpful.
That would be
Does the
helpful.
department, sorry about that, did I interrupt you?
No, that would be helpful.
Okay. Madam Hearing Officer, may I? Oh, thank you. You're well ahead of me. Just. Okay, so for the benefit of the parties and the board, this was the filing from Friday, sorry, just making sure I had the right document up. Friday, September 24th, from both EDF and Kinder Morgan, and I'll just scroll down here to the proposed language.
Ms.
I'm not
Gutierrez?
seeing anything.
Oh, you're not?
Ms.
I'm sorry.
Gutierrez, I don't know.
Let's try again then. Sorry about that. Do you see anything now?
No,
No.
there's just a gray window there.
Okay, let me try again.
But
Sorry about that.
I may add that I do recall what the reference that you're referring to, and I did have a chance to review that.
Okay. Let me try this one more time, and if it doesn't work, I'll move us along because I don't want to delay us. I have a spinning wheel, so I'm going to let that think. Okay. Can you see the language on the screen now?
Yes,
Okay, great. Let me. Oh, you're going to probably see.
Ms.
What this
Gutierrez, we have a
Yes.
request from a board member for the number of the exhibit.
A request for what? I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
Oh, sorry, the exhibit number.
So this was filed by EDF and Kinder Morgan as a notice of alternate proposal that we would be presenting in our presentations. We would be happy, and this was through conversation with multiple parties, we would be happy to additionally support it, submit it as an exhibit. We did file it with Ms. Jones, and I think understood that it would be circulated to the board members.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Sorry about this. Too many screens. Okay, so with the language now on the screen, and you're having reviewed it, does the department support the joint revised language proposed by EDF and Kinder Morgan?
yes,
And is it your understanding, just taking this a little bit more into context, that the current federal NSPS Quad OA applicable to transmission compressor stations is quarterly, which is the same time frame or same frequency that EDF and Kinder Morgan are proposing here in this rule?
yes,
Okay. And then in NMED's Exhibit 1, page 56, your testimony states that the department was previously most concerned with the reference to compliance with federal NSPS leak detection programs due to changes in the federal program with changes in administration. Is that understanding correct?
yes,
Okay. So then do you agree that the EDF and Kinder Morgan proposal with the use of language at least as stringent as NSPS Quad OA that's effective as of today provides the backstop that ensures the department's goals with leak detection are achieved because the current NSPS Quad OA applicable to transmission compressor stations is quarterly?
Yes.
Thank you. And I think one last question, and just as clarification as to the department's interpretation of this joint proposal, following that line, is it fair to say then that when the department evaluates that the federal NSPS is, quote, at least as stringent as NSPS Quad OA existing as of today, what we really mean is that the federal NSPS must require at least quarterly frequency for leak detection. Is that correct?
Yes.
Thank you, and I have no further questions for Ms. Keene. Thank you, Ms. Keene.
Thank you, Ms. Gutierrez. I see Mr. Rose.
Yes, Madam Hearing Officer, just a question of clarification. Ms. Keene, I assume we heard testimony, which seems like a year ago now, with respect to small businesses, that there were some provisions of your proposal that were applicable to small businesses, and it was my recollection that this was one of them. Is that still the case? Did I remember that correctly?
That's correct.
That was the only question I had, Madam Hearing Officer.
Thank you. I think I saw Mr. Heiser there briefly. There you are.
Yes, Madam Hearing Officer, I'm here. And I will say that we are happy that Kinder Morgan, EDF, and the department have reached an agreement, but we would note that that seems inconsistent with the prior rulings of this hearing officer about NMOGA and its information. Rather than belabor that point, let's move on to Ms. Keene. So, Ms. Keene, in the provisions of your rebuttal testimony on your Exhibit 1, NMED, Rebuttal Exhibit 1, page 56, you expressed concern about allowance of subparts Quad O and Quad OA to meet the requirements of Part 50.
That's correct.
And putting aside the fact that you just agreed to accept those for Kinder Morgan in the prior testimony, your objection here is to the programs. It's not, is it to the use of the method or is it to the program that your objection relates to?
I'm not clear on your question, Mr.
And that's fair because that wasn't as articulate as it may be. If we were to go out and conduct a subpart Quad O or Quad OA investigation using the appropriate methodology that also meets the department specifications in Part 50, would you accept that LDAR activity as meeting the requirements of Part 50, even though it was also done for purposes of complying with subparts Quad O or Quad OA?
Only if it was conducted on the frequency as required in Part 50. If everything else aligned, it would be unacceptable.
So you're not proposing to require us to sniff the valve once for Quad OA purposes and then to sniff it again for our Part 50 purposes?
No, an operator, if Part 50 is more stringent, then ideally complying with Part 50 would also comply with Quad OA.
So as long as the technical requirements are met, then it can be used for multiple purposes. Thank you for that clarification. You also stated that you didn't believe that the Quad O and Quad OA frequency information that was gathered by the federal EPA in terms of the frequency for leak detection and repair activities were appropriate because a number of the facilities across New Mexico are older than the NSPS equipment at issue in that survey. Is that correct?
That's one point that was made, yes.
Okay. Would not that newer equipment be relevant to new equipment under the new equipment provisions of this proposal? Or could it not be?
I'm unclear about what the question is.
Well, your complaint was that I believe that there was older equipment across New Mexico, but is there not also newer equipment across New Mexico?
There is both older and newer equipment across New Mexico.
And so would not the federal information that NMOGA provided about leak frequency at that newer facilities be relevant to newer facilities?
It would be relevant to newer facilities.
Did you give any consideration to that as part of your evaluation?
It's unknown if we gave consideration to that in the evaluation.
Okay, thank you. What is the frequency of AVO inspections that you're requiring the operators to do? Is it basically monthly or in the rule?
It's weekly or monthly, depending on the production or throughput rate.
And in part, were you responding to testimony that you've seen from experts such as Mr. Lyons that much of the leak depends upon the maintenance status of the equipment?
No, that wasn't the basis for that requirement.
So what was the basis for the requirement then?
And may I believe that that was included in the original petition on May 6th.
It was.
It may be. I think I'm still entitled to an answer. This is her summary of both direct and rebuttal.
I would just say that I don't see how we would have been relying on information from Mr. Lyons if we were proposing it initially in the petition.
Excellent question. So let me rephrase it and say, without regard to what Mr. Lyons may or may not have said in this hearing, what was the basis for the department's choice of the AVO frequency?
That higher production facilities will have necessarily higher, more equipment with more leakage opportunities and should be inspected more frequently.
And what's the department's hope behind the inspection provision?
That leaks are discovered and fixed.
Okay. And it's your understanding that that's required under the OCD rules as well, either weekly or monthly, depending on certain thresholds?
That is correct.
In page 59 of your testimony on exhibit 23, or rebuttal exhibit number 1, NMOGA proposed that if certain equipment was fixed at the time it was discovered that no tagging would be required, and the department accepted that. Is that correct?
Yes.
And so do you agree that it's desirable that industry be able to fix it right away, that that's what you're seeking to occur?
Yes.
And then you also, there was an Oxy comment that you responded to where they talked about leak survey for equipment constructed prior to the effective date. And this is where you, I'm sorry, I can't read my note here. Let's skip that for the moment. Now, you talked about inactive and wellhead facilities are required to conduct a one-time survey in your rebuttal testimony. Why did you move to a one-time survey at the time of your rebuttal testimony for those facilities? This is the bottom of page 59.
Yeah, so as I discussed, we dealt with very a voluminous set of direct and rebuttal testimony on equipment leaks, and the objective was to provide a middle ground proposal for the board's consideration that was crafted as a kind of a middle ground approach based on the two competing sets of information that was provided by the different stakeholders.
I appreciate the, I guess, the politicness of that, but I'm wondering what the technical basis is that underlied the department's decision to move from one-time to annual, I believe, for these facilities. That would have been raised in Oxy's comments.
So I'm not clear what your question is.
So did you undertake any type of technical evaluation on the tons that would be reduced or the costs that were incurred by industry by moving from the one-time only to an annual standard?
So we prepared cost estimates and emission reductions on our original proposal. And so to the extent that that was covered in our original proposal, we did conduct that analysis.
Did you ever consider any incremental costs from moving from one standard to another? For example, from annual to semi-annual or from one time to annual?
That information is in our direct testimony in the cost spreadsheets. I think it's broken out. There's a series of frequencies. The cost estimates are based on a series of frequencies, and that information is found within our spreadsheets, and Mr. Palmer can confirm that.
Okay, thank you. I'm getting my, let's see. NMOGA proposed to revise exempting certain facilities that process only coal bed methane. Can you explain to us the department's understanding of the VOC content of coal bed methane versus natural gas produced from conventional operations?
Coal bed methane typically has a much lower VOC content.
Okay, and then in the recent discussion that you had with Ms. Gutierrez for Kinder Morgan, I believe that they raised the fact that there is lower VOC and that you accepted that as a basis for reduction in frequency. Is that rationale also appropriate for coal bed methane?
Yes.
Thank you. On page 60 of your testimony, you said that you went to the rebuttal proposal to more closely align with the Colorado rules. Can you give us a brief thumbnail description of the rationale for why you thought Colorado was appropriate?
They have a similar set of facilities. They have an established LDAR frequency program that has been in effect for some time, and that was agreed upon at those rulemaking hearings.
And in fact, I think you testified earlier in this proceeding that those rules have been in effect since around 2009 and subject to periodic redevelopment and reevaluation in Colorado. Is that correct?
Those were for pneumatics, yes. So to the extent the LDAR program, yes. I don't know the exact date of when they implemented their LDAR program.
Okay, thank you. Now, earlier you noted that we have in New Mexico, thanks to the OCD and now also to the proposal from MNED, a fairly extensive AVO investigation of these facilities. Does that weigh in our decision about how frequently we should conduct the instrumental evaluation or OGI evaluation under LDAR?
No, I think they complement each other.
Can you explain what it is that we're seeking to do that's different between those programs?
AVO is it doesn't require a specific technology. It's going to be more subjective, but it happens more frequently. And it's a screening evaluation for looking for obvious leaks that can be detected using those methods.
And
It's a technology-based inspection that's targeting specific pollutants.
so is it fair to say that the department thinks that an AVO inspection might find particularly big leaks that are obvious? That might.
Yes.
And that's your interest in the, sorry, I'm losing my voice. And that's your interest in the LDAR program is for the smaller leaks, things like valve stems, flanges, connectors, things of that nature.
Yes.
And can we just clarify, Mr. Heiser, we can maybe talk about it as enhanced LDAR, might help.
Yeah. I have to struggle with the fact I printed stuff on 2 pages and I keep getting them flip-flopped. So my next question, I think, goes to page 61. And this was, NMOGA proposed to add language to paragraph 6, Ms. Keen, and you probably remember this, where we argued that leaks detected should not be subject to enforcement action unless the owner fails to perform the required repairs. And the department declined to present or to accept that change. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And what was the rationale that the department provided for not undertaking or not including that in the rule? And I believe it's set forth in that paragraph.
LDAR inspections provide important information to owners and operators regarding the condition of sources and the overall state of operations at a facility. There may be instances where the department discovers egregious violations from leaking components that present an imminent and substantial danger to human health or the environment, or repeated leaks from the same components that indicate a systemic pattern of failure by the owner or operator to maintain sources and components in good working order. The board should not categorically limit the department's enforcement authority in the manner proposed. Doing so would unreasonably hinder the department's ability to enforce on violations and would conflict with the department's existing regulatory and statutory authority to take enforcement action for violations of the Air Quality Control Act in Part 50.
Thank you, Ms. Keen. I appreciate that. And do you still believe that today as you're testifying here to the board?
Yes.
Okay. And I think your understanding based on industry's prior statement in that is that industry doesn't really disagree with the standard that you've just articulated either, correct? We're interested in a level playing field for good operators.
That's correct.
Okay. My question is, I'm going to ask you a hypothetical and crave the indulgence of your counsel, who's glowering at me on the screen. So right now we have a bureau which is interested in working with all parties and moving this forward and making emissions reductions. But the rule that you propose would actually make any leak a violation just at the department say so. Is that correct?
I think it depends on our evaluation of the leak and whether or not we would consider that a violation or not.
So basically, you're saying it's at your sole discretion as to whether or not it would be a violation.
It would be, but in that decision, it is required, we must show good cause for that decision, and that decision that is appealable.
Do you think it's reasonable for industry to push back on just handing a check to an agency? Because once this goes into the rules, any agency, not just Liz and Laura and the people that we know there now, can make those decisions in the future. Do you think that how things may be applied in the future may be a legitimate concern to industry?
That's just a mischaracterization, I think, of what the testimony that Ms. Keen just read and what she's saying.
All right, would you rephrase, please, Mr. Heiser?
So my question to Ms. Keen is whether interpretations can change over time and whether industry should be concerned about that.
The record on this rulemaking is clear and our intent is clear.
Okay. Thank you, Ms. Keen. Appreciate that clarification as well. And Ms. Katz. On page 63, I think, of your testimony, I think we're still in your nope, we're in the cost analysis. Are you speaking to this or is it going to be Mr. Palmer?
That will be Mr. Palmer. I can see if I can answer the question, but Mr. Palmer should probably join us also.
Were we able to get Mr. Palmer?
I'm here.
Okay, good. So in your testimony, Ms. Keen and Mr. Palmer, you talk about model plant information based on information, the greenhouse gas reporting plant for the Permian and San Juan basins. And then you also talked about the 2016 CTG information that you provided. And you testified that you couldn't evaluate the validity or representativeness of the alternative model plants mentioned a moment ago because you said NMOGA didn't document its testimony or exhibits the actual model plants. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Did NMOGA provide the underlying data in Exhibit 27 that was filed and admitted in this proceeding?
Yes, NMOGA provided a printout from the Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program, but there were no spreadsheets indicating how those GHGRP data were manipulated to create model plants or whatever you used to present the results.
Okay. And did you consider those spreadsheets in light of the testimony of Mr. Smitherman on direct?
I'm sorry, could you please restate that?
Did you consider what was in the spreadsheet in light of the testimony of Mr. Smitherman on direct in this proceeding?
I'm sorry, which testimony?
Would have been a NMOGA Exhibit A1, testimony of John Smitherman in response to John Eldar.
His testimony referred to some tables in the red line of the rule.
And so your testimony is that you were unable to determine between Mr. Smitherman's testimony, the red line tables, and the exhibit what he was talking about.
I had a general sense, but I could not draw a firm conclusion or evaluate how he came up with those numbers that were in the tables in the red line. It was not clear that he had created those tables in the red line because the red line was not attributed to any particular witness. And so that's as far as we took it.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Palmer. A little bit further on that page, there's testimony. This sounds perhaps more like Ms. Keene, but perhaps it was you, Mr. Palmer, that is beyond the scope of this rulemaking to reassess EPA's response to particular API, being the American Petroleum Institute, comments on the 2016 control technique guidelines in the absence of additional information. Is it your understanding that those API comments went to the costs that were being used?
Yes, that was my understanding.
And so how would discussion of costs be beyond the scope of the Air Quality Control Act, which makes cost one of the considerations for the board?
I reviewed the EPA's response to those API comments, and they seem to have responded to them completely. And I assumed then that those comments and EPA's response were reflected in the CTG's costs. And so I felt that it was beyond the scope of our project using the CTG cost estimates to do any further analysis.
So your scope from NMED was to use the CTG cost estimates and make a cost analysis.
That was what we decided to do within the scope of our project.
Okay. And did you discuss that scoping decision with Ms. Keene, or was that one internal to ERG?
That was covered in our regular meetings that we had as a team.
So Ms. Keene, is it your belief that those comments are outside the scope of this rulemaking? And you're on mute. Sorry, Ms. Keene. Or at least I can't hear you.
I don't think that, well, I think we've addressed our position on that in our rebuttal testimony.
Yeah, and I believe Mr. Palmer stated what it was, which was that those comments were already taken into account by EPA. And so that's why we decided that we weren't going to take them up again and rehash them and relitigate them here.
Okay. And is the department taking the same position on other proposals that were made by other parties about expanding or increasing frequencies that were raised in the scope of those prior testimony in the EPA proceeding, or are you re-entertaining those here?
if you can point us to where that is in our testimony where we are willing to go over those comments in the same way, we can address that.
Okay.
I don't
good.
know where you're referring to.
In page 64 of your testimony, Nemoga cited a Paxi, Adam, and Ferrara study on equipment leak detection and quantification at 67 oil and gas sites in the western United States. Do you remember that, Ms. Keene or Mr. Palmer?
Yes, I do.
Okay, thank you. Didn't Nemoga produce this study in Exhibit 5?
Yes,
And doesn't that study provide fairly detailed information on leak frequencies for different types of components?
I believe it does.
Okay. So what part of additional detailed comparison were you requesting that Nemoga provide?
And can I just clarify, can I just bring us back to, that we have said that, as Ms. Keene said in her presentation, that we were not able to go through all the studies of everything, and that is why we were relying on the parties to present that information to the board and for the board to make that decision, and that we weren't advancing anything here about those studies because we weren't unable to process all of them. So I feel like it's probably better for that to be put on through your own witnesses.
So your testimony is we should put that on in our own witness. Is that what you just said?
Yes,
On those
that's,
studies that you included in as your exhibits.
But at this point, the department's testimony is that you and ERG did not particularly review the study.
I think maybe we reviewed the abstract. I did not review the study in detail.
Okay. Now, we also cited a Colorado State University study, and I'm sure I'm going to draw the same basic comment from you. But there, however, you went on to say that the study indicates that the study emission factors agree with or are larger than the current greenhouse gas reporting. Doesn't this show some issues with the CTG document that you were relying upon? And obviously you evaluated it to that extent, because there's divergences between the CTG and the greenhouse gas reporting program.
That testimony was from the abstract of the study.
So, okay, so this is this. And then Mr. Palmer, perhaps this is better to you. What is the greenhouse gas reporting program and what does it involve?
The greenhouse gas reporting program is a mandatory reporting program for generally facilities that have facility-wide emissions greater than 25,000 metric tons per year of CO2 equivalents.
And for the oil and gas industry in specific, does not that reporting program require that you give specific equipment counts for things like connectors or compressors or acid gas units or things like that as part of the reporting program?
That's correct.
And aren't we as operators required to update that information each year that we file those reports in order to be true, complete, and accurate under the federal program?
That's correct.
So if we look back at the CTG document that was the basis for the ERG report, when was much of that data developed? I'll represent to you that it's 1996. Does that comport with your memory?
Yes, that's correct. That was, yes.
So, Mr. Palmer, given that you have two sources of data, one that dates back to 1996 and one that is relatively current, like 2018, at the point you would have been working at this in 2019, why the preference for the CTG document and not the greenhouse gas reporting document?
Greenhouse gas reporting, there is no greenhouse gas reporting document. There's a rule. There are data. Those data would need to be synthesized. The CTG has not been withdrawn as guidance by EPA in response to the data that have been collected through the GHGRP.
So anything else, Mr. Palmer? I don't want to cut you off at all. I want to make sure we get all of your testimony.
Within the time frame, scope, and resources of this project, we used the CTG.
So, Mr. Palmer, Ms. Keene, at the time that the 1996 CTG was done, was there extensive coal bed methane production? Or is that all post-dated, that 1996 review?
Yes, I believe coal bed methane was being extracted in the state during that time.
Okay. And then was there extensive use of what we've heard referred to as unconventional production in 1996, or has that been a more recent development?
There was unconventional drilling at that time as well.
Was it as prevalent as it is now?
Probably, I would say no.
Thank you. So you said that the NMOGA analysis didn't take into account estimated leak rates, including the presence of large emitters relative to those that were found in the 2016 CTG estimates. Does the 2016 CTG actually include large emitters, or is that information we've heard from other sources?
I am not sure.
Thank you. And then there's another statement on page 65 that NMED has concluded it's beyond the scope of this rulemaking for the board to conduct a literature review on fugitive emissions. And so I guess, once again, that goes to your concern that you think we as industry need to provide that to you, not that you need to do that work.
So we received extensive testimony from all stakeholders, and both stakeholder groups cited opposing scientific studies that supported their own position, and it was numerous studies supporting their own position. And so it's not within the scope of this rulemaking to do a meta-analysis, which is what it would take to review all of those peer-reviewed scientific studies to come up with new emission factors for New Mexico sources. That is well beyond the scope of this rulemaking. And so we correctly relied upon accepted emission factors in the CTG, which provides a model rule for states doing just what we are here doing today.
So your position is that if you have an EPA document, additional testimony by other parties is really not relevant to the board's consideration?
No, that's not what I stated.
And I believe, once again, we've said that we are asking the parties to put that testimony on for the board's consideration, because we did not have a chance to be able to process all of it.
On page 66, you go back to the Quad O and Quad OA and expressed a concern that they may be revised as a basis for not allowing use of Quad O or Quad OA to demonstrate attainment. Haven't you already addressed that concern, though, Ms. Keene, with provisions that you made in section 20.2.50.112? I think it's CA10, which freezes the date of those programs as of the effective date?
I think you're asking two different questions. We don't agree that Quad O and Quad OA are effectively controlling fugitive emissions, and so we are proposing to go beyond the spiral requirements, which is what we're required to do in order to reduce VOC emissions
I-
from these
Not to
sources.
contradict you, Ms. Keen, but your statement is that that the purpose of this is to provide statewide, right, that it's not subject to changes that occur at the federal level.
We were highlighting that federal regulations can have, and we just went through a new administration rolling back federal requirements. And so formalizing those requirements in the state rule establishes certainty about what those inspection frequencies are and removes the possibility that new federal administrations can roll back those standards.
And my question to you is, didn't you solve that issue by the change you made to section 112, A10?
We did for those facilities where we think it's an acceptable level of frequency, but that is, we've only agreed to that for one specific type of operation within this sector, and it's not appropriate for those remaining upstream and midstream operations.
Okay, and then this looks like it's a Mr. Palmer question on the bottom of page 67 of the rebuttal testimony. There are a series of discussions about OGI and method 22 instrument monitoring at these facilities. Why were you recommending at that time these provisions, Mr. Palmer?
Which are you referring to specifically?
The bottom of page 67, lines 13 through 23 in particular. Says NMED is proposing changes to the LDAR inspection frequencies and emission thresholds to align with Colorado Reg 7 and accepting NEMOGA's proposal regarding gas processing plants and gathering and boosting stations, if that refreshes your memory.
I believe I'm going to defer to Ms. Kuhn on that because this is part of our rebuttal testimony that we've gone back to the earlier version of the rule. And so
I'm
I
asking
think
you
that
about
goes
the
back to the
thought
earlier.
process at the rebuttal time and the rationale that was advanced by you and Ms. Keene for this provision.
I'm going to just say that we are going back to the earlier version of the rule.
Madam Hearing Officer, I've asked a pretty clear question, and I think it's clear the witness is not answering.
So I remember Ms. Keene earlier referencing the fact that they had simply reverted. I'm sorry, do I misunderstand that you're asking a different question, Mr. Palmer?
I'm asking the question for why they switched to the position in their rebuttal, which I'm entitled to know because that's their testimony in rebuttal. They can change their mind, but I'm entitled to know the rationale for why they moved at that point in time.
All right, Mr. Palmer, can you answer the question?
And that's actually a question for Ms. Keene. So can Ms. Keene please answer that question?
Absolutely. If Ms. Keene is more appropriate, Ms. Katz, I'm fine
Yeah.
with whoever.
So
I think
and
she's already stated it, but she can state it again.
Well,
we
let's
will
let her
state it
say it.
again. We were attempting to provide a middle ground proposal for the board's consideration that balanced the two competing and opposing sets of information that was provided by stakeholders.
Okay, so you say you were trying to balance. I'd like to understand what the balancing was that you were considering as you were making that decision.
That we have two opposing stakeholder groups providing sets of scientific data that support their own position that either, so we have one stakeholder group saying that we have overestimated the costs, radically overestimated the costs, and then the leak rates are far, far fewer than what EPA believes they are and what the department believes they are. And then a competing set of stakeholder positions that say we have radically underestimated the cost of these and the leak rates are much, much, much higher, orders of magnitude higher than what EPA and the department believes they are. And so between those two opposing sets of information, data, cost analysis, we were attempting to strike a balance between those two competing data sets.
Okay, and at least at the time of the rebuttal, that balance had shifted in favor of slightly less frequent LDAR. Is that correct?
it shifted. Yes.
Thank This is perhaps a question for, well, it might be for either one of you. It's on page 68 of your rebuttal. You state that NMED is updating the emissions reductions and cost estimate spreadsheet to reflect the revised frequencies and will submit the updated spreadsheet prior to the hearing to allow time for the other parties to review. What exhibit number is that was updated and submitted to the other parties?
I'm sorry, what?
Might be a question for you.
And I don't believe, I believe once we went back to the previous proposal, then we wouldn't have been updating those.
Okay, so that was not, you didn't do it because you reverted as your testimony.
Correct.
Thank you, Ms. Keen, for that. And then throughout your testimony, you state in a couple places, and I think the one here is on page 68. While NMED is proposing to revise the monitoring frequencies, NMED will consider further testimony provided by any of the parties that would support a recommendation that the board adopt different frequencies and/or cost effectiveness estimates. Is that correct?
Yes.
Except that you've moved to exclude all of the NMOGA testimony on those issues, more or less. Is that true?
Objection, we didn't move to exclude all the testimony, mischaracterizing
Sorry
our
about it.
objection.
Thank you, Madam Hearing Officer. That's all my questions for Ms. Keen and Mr. Paul.
Thank you very much, Mr. Heiser. Are there other parties with questions of the department panel? Please turn on your camera. I don't see anyone. In that case, we will turn to questions from the board. While I'm doing that, in the event you're an attendee on this platform and have a question, please reach out through the chat. Madam Chair, do you have questions?
Thank you, Madam Hearing Officer, and I appreciate the panel and discussion and the cross. At this time, I don't have any additional questions.
Thank you. Vice Chair Trujillo Davis.
I don't have any additional questions, and I do appreciate the discussion up until this point. Thank you.
Thank you. Member Kate. Member Bitzer.
Just waiting for Demi Moore, Jack Nicholson, and Tom Cruise to come on and say, "You can't handle the truth." Anyway, no, I don't have any questions, but I enjoy the lively discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Member Garcia.
No questions, thank you.
Thank you. And Member Honker.
No questions, thank you.
All right, thank you. Ms. Katz, will there be any redirect?
No, nothing from me at this time. Thank you, Madam Hearing Officer.
All right, thank you so much, Ms. Keen and Mr. Palmer. Let's see. It is about 5 after 12. I wouldn't necessarily want to put anyone in the position of just needing to put on 10 minutes of testimony. We would be going from here. Let me just confirm where we'd be going from here. We would be going to Mr. Smitherman. So,
Madam Hearing Officer, I would need to check with Mr. Smitherman about our effort to rejuggle our slides. So it might be better to start with a different industry or other party witness while we're trying to accommodate your ruling from earlier today.
all right, well, let's, you know what, let's spend just a little more time on that then, and then we'll break for lunch and come back at 1. And please, any counsel who have something to offer here. We do have an email from Ms. Fox sent a little more than an hour ago, identifying the slides that NMED, EDF, and Clean Air Advocates believe reflect information from the 2 slides with data that was offered, in my opinion, late. Those slides are 10, 11, 29, 31, 32, 34, 35, 38, 46, 47, 48, 50, and 52 through 56. Now, as I understand, again, just to summarize my feelings about it, I believed they should be excluded from the board's consideration because they reflect data that NMOGA has had since July that was offered on the afternoon of the fourth day of hearing. Your counsel, Ms. Solaria, advised you to hear the evidence and to take up the question of whether it should be A, excluded from deliberations, or B, included with perhaps an opportunity for the parties who would be prejudiced by the inclusion of the data in the record without an opportunity to rebut it, thus necessitating a reopening of the record. But again, the board would not be reviewing the exclusion from deliberations, yes, until the beginning of deliberations. So it's, let me put it this way, I guess it sounds as though we would proceed, Mr. Heiser and the other counsel, with the understanding that the board would not be deciding on exclusion until the beginning of their deliberations. So if Ms. Solaria has heard this summary and I've said it wrong, I would invite her to leap back onto the screen. Otherwise, I'll accept council's comments.
Madam Hearing Officer, this is Council Floria, and I agree that you've summarized my advice and what we discussed accurately. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Ms. Fox, do you have an observation?
Thank you, Madam Hearing Officer. I have nothing to add except that I would just again emphasize that what NMOGA would do is make a proffer of evidence and not give the evidence itself.
All right, thank you. Ms. Solaria, would you leap back on, please, and clarify your advice there for the board?
There we go. Yes, as I stated earlier, my understanding and my advice for the board would be at this juncture to consider a proffer of the evidence. I do believe that, as stated by NMOGA's counsel, they should have a reasonable opportunity at this point to ready that proffer for their presentation through their witness, and that it would be considered as a proffer right now. The board would be exposed to it, but they would make the ultimate decision whether or not to consider it as evidence at the top of their deliberations.
Okay, anything to add, Ms. Katz?
No, nothing from me.
Okay,
So,
Mr. Heiser?
Madam Hearing Officer, are you asking me to explain what Mr. Smitherman would proffer? Or are you asking Mr. Smitherman to briefly state what he would state about the slides? It's a little bit unclear to me whom you're asking to do that.
All right, what I'm trying to do is honor Ms. Solaria's role in advising the board. Ms. Solaria, what would you advise?
I would advise that it be done at this point through counsel. I think that's probably a clear distinction between a proffer versus what is evidence if it's done through counsel versus a witness. So in that sense, I retract what I think I was unclear a minute ago. And I do think that's more in keeping with it being a proffer, in any other case rather than a presentation of admitted evidence.
All right, thank you. That's what I would have offered as well. Any questions about any of this?
So, Ms. Orth, I don't believe that we necessarily agree with Ms. Fox's rather latitudinarian approach of your ruling earlier today. There's a number of items that she's striking that are from Mr. Smitherman's direct testimony, where he refers to facts and figures that are set forth in the NMOGA comments, which are in the administrative record, or you call the record proper, and where that needs to be considered in light of what he said in order to understand what Mr. Smitherman's testimony is. There are other parts of her testimony which I think we can do a proffer on. And I'm happy to do that, I guess, at this time as best I can, given that we've been in hearing all the time since I was asked to do this.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Heiser. So it sounds as though there might be then 3 categories of evidence coming in through Mr. Smitherman. The evidence and testimony that is not objectionable, the evidence and testimony that should, to the extent it merely reflects the new data from the spreadsheets, should simply be made part of the proffer through your lips, Mr. Heiser. And then perhaps a third category in which, if you want to point to Mr. Smitherman's direct testimony, perhaps we should just take it subject to objection. Because I don't want to clutter up the record while Mr. Smitherman is speaking with a lot of argument. I'd like to move through this.
Okay, so my understanding is, and I will ask Ms. Katz, because I think she's speaking to slides 10 and 11, and I'm trying to look at what the slides are at the same time. This is our example of the model plant in response to the question. But so on this, I assume that you're looking for a proffer, Ms. Katz, is that correct?
I believe that the proffer would be right, as Ms. Soloria stated. Those are slides that we identified as containing new information that we hadn't seen previously.
Okay. So our proffer on this is that in the direct testimony, there were tables that provided information about a NMOGA model plant. In the rebuttal, there were questions about what that NMOGA model plant is. In NMOGA's testimony, in exhibit, I believe it's 27, NMOGA provided the greenhouse gas reporting data. Mr. Smitherman's testimony would have explained that he took that data in exhibit 27, divided by the number of well counts, divided the number of wells by 2 to calculate the number of facilities, and then divided the number of pieces of equipment by the number of facilities to come up with the so-called greenhouse gas reporting program model plant, which is not very different, honestly, it's a little bit different from the CTG model.
Okay, thank you. I'm wondering, though, if it would be helpful to break for lunch, Mr. Heiser.
Yeah, I mean, would it be helpful, we could put together, maybe Ms. Fox could provide a little bit more explanation behind why she thinks certain slides. I think we understand 52 to 56, Hannah, Ms. Fox, why your objections are to those, and I think we understand 10 to 11, but we would be helped if you could provide maybe a line about what the questions are about the other slides so that I can tailor it more specifically to what your concern is.
That sounds good, Mr. Heiser. We collaborated with NMED and Mr. Palmer on this list, and so we'll provide you that information.
I think our particular questions are on slides 29 through 46, if that, yeah, between those two, between 29 and 46 are the ones that we had the most question about what the concern was. And so, Madam Hearing Officer, why don't we postpone this to the end of the day so that we don't waste any more hearing time? And we'll move forward. And I may come back and say that there are a couple of slides in the 29 to 46 range, which we think are in the direct, and maybe we can hash that out then. And then on the proffers, we can push all that back to the end of the hearing, so we're not using people's feisty period when they're awake on those issues, or if that makes sense.
It does make sense. Thank you, Mr. Heiser. It's 12:16. Let's break until 1. We'll return for public comments and proceed as you've just described. Thank you all.
Thank you.